I think it's quite easy to write off a remake. It is all too easy to feel that remakes of games we play nowadays do not adhere to what the original stood for or what it played like. I talked about Persona 3 Reload a while ago, and why I thought it deserved defending. Ultimately, I believe that while it is not entirely accurate to the original games, it is an accurate enough adaptation of the original work to consider it a worthwhile entry in the series, and more importantly, a worthwhile remake. In that original video about Persona 3, I had claimed that I've never had to experience one of my favourite games getting remastered and ruined, in a sense. So, it's possible there's something about this remake that I just don't understand. That was actually a lie. I think it's quite easy to write off a remake. Today I'd like to use Resident Evil 3 as an example to explore my stance on remakes a little further by presenting an example of a game providing little to no value to me because of how it shatters its ties to the original. In a sense, I intend to explore the position of a Fez purist by substituting a love for Fez with a love for Resident Evil 3. It's possible to enjoy this game from start to finish. However, the issue that I have with this game is the fact that Resident Evil 3, despite being a remake of the original 1998 PS1 game, actually plays nothing like it. And because of that, I believe the game at its very core has very little reason to exist. It takes locations previously featured and either dumbs them down so much that they barely resemble what they were intended to imitate, blatantly cut entire areas featured in the original, only to replace them with areas that have almost nothing to do with the original game, or place references to those areas in sight but out of reach. When it does this, it also simultaneously weakens the game's challenge and replayability, as it does not do anything unique or interesting with how it builds out its areas to create something worth coming back to again and again. Overall, it retains thematic and visual aspects from the original, but nothing more. The game is completely different from the original in a way that I would think separates them almost entirely, as without the Resident Evil name, I wouldn't know that this was a remake of 3. This video is quite long, but in essence, Resident Evil 3, for me, fails, not only as a remake because of its shattered ties to the original on PS1, but also as a base-level survival horror. I believe the decision to cut content from the original hurts the game in a way that undermines its existence, as without this being a Resident Evil title, I don't think the game has any foundation to stand on. This is
Resident Evil 3.
The gameplay of Resident Evil is something that from the very first game has been formulated down to a science. So, while the gameplay throughout the first 3 are almost identical to each other, the reason they were so popular is not only because the formula was so engaging on its own that it warranted multiple games, but also the difference in challenges you face throughout them. In Resident Evil 1, you are trapped within the halls of the Spencer Mansion. In Resident Evil 2, your objective is to explore the RPD. In Resident Evil 3, you are met with the sprawling streets of Raccoon City. This admittedly for RE3 was a wild diversion compared to the first 2 installments, but in the original it's handled with such care and passion that it's engaging even on a 3rd or 4th playthrough. Almost the entire game takes place in the city, and you progress by walking through it and exploring its twisting structure, finding shortcuts through buildings to avoid lethal obstacles, or solving puzzles in blocked off alleyways to open up the map in a way that presents you with more options for traversal. Resident Evil 3's opening, while slow, is quite masterful because of how it allows you to familiarise yourself with the layout and the state of Raccoon City without any outside influence. The quiet ambiance of a city falling to ruins haunts your exploration. All of a sudden, BANG! An event happens to you in front of your very eyes. Your options are to explore the basement where it came from, or run from the danger that threatens your very life. The remake throws it all away. Brad Vickers is essentially your tour guide to the opening of the game, taking you on a scripted 10-minute segment to fuck around with him, barely engaging with the game, as a majority of it can be done with a button press, for it to eventually end up here. The game only allows you to make decisions and explore the city on your own in sections specifically designed for it. There is no such thing as a city beyond the walls of the area allocated to you. It's all in front of you, and if not, then it doesn't exist. A large theme of the comparisons between the remake and the original is how it seems that the developers of RE3 didn't understand it almost at all. The central reason for that criticism, I believe, comes from the condensed area you are allotted to play in. This is supposed to be the wide, sprawling cityscape that was present throughout the whole of the original PS1 game. There are no branching paths for you to explore or navigate, and there's very limited backtracking or exploration required to map the full area. While it gives the illusion that the city is as deep and as wide as an ocean, all of the places of interest from the original game lie beyond its boundary. Places that were not just referenced, but actually featured in the original game. For what it's supposed to represent, it's a very straightforward map with very little room to strategize or improvise. Navigation is almost always going to be the same for every person playing, unless you're one of the 10 people that use this shortcut, which is just one of only 2 ways through this street anyway. It's very basic. Not to mention that the puzzles or obstacles in the remake are not handled with the same depth and nuance that the original had. Because the game is so different structurally from the original, another problem with it is that aspects and places from the original game have to be presented entirely differently, which means that those same aspects are condensed into what I would consider to be nostalgia bait. Everything you end up doing or end up experiencing is almost always going to be referencing or adapting something you do in the original, without much of the same mechanical function as the original. So even if it wasn't meant to be, every time the game does this, it feels like a surface level game of... but it doesn't understand why these pieces were in the game in the first place. This wall of fire is a great example, because it just shows how differently the game functions between remake and original. As you explore Raccoon City, you have a couple huge objectives in the environment that are asking you to come back later. The alleyway next to this safe room is just one of those many objectives. While you're doing things in the city, you'll attain the item to get past this wall of fire. Then, your objective updates. You need to get past this wall of fire to access this building. The reason the game likes to do this is to reinforce the labyrinthian structure the game is built upon, as this area is featured within the first couple minutes of the game. But to get past it, you must explore your options around the city, making progress towards your ultimate goal along the way. In the remake, it's the first fucking objective. There is no long, winding trek to go get it, and there isn't an exercise in exploration. It points you to where you need to go, you go there, you come back. This drastic difference between remake and original shows exactly what is so wrong with this game. As a remake, what is this supposed to represent? What experience are you getting from playing this game that the original had intended? This puzzle demonstrates with incredible speed that you aren't getting an experience comparable to what was originally laid out for you on PS1. This was supposed to be the start of Resident Evil 3. The garage is where the game transitions from its introduction into the actual game.
Stop there. Shush. Okay, come forward. This is Mr. Poppadom. He can't hear us, watching child porn. Little boys.
He's not integral to the story. Instead, he's supposed to be a cool little side objective you could come back to if you felt like it. And if you did, you would get rewarded with a little bit of lore and a couple useful items. In the remake, this is the only time you see him, and you can't come back through here for a side objective or useful items. Not only does the game now not give you an accurate representation as to what the game was originally, this is technically cut content. The garage is almost a perfect one-to-one rendition of the original place, but it's been reduced to a reference rather than a playable area. There are more examples to cover later, but I think that overall, these small, almost irrelevant pieces that were supposed to be from the original game are added in an attempt to justify itself as a remake, because the game is already so far removed from how the original was at a bedrock level that adding these places and events doesn't come off as honouring the original work, but a slap in the face. There is no way to justify any of this game as honouring the original, as it doesn't do any of the things the original does in its gameplay, its story, spoiler alert, nor any of these self-referential Easter eggs. I don't even want to call them that. Which is to say that I think Resident Evil 3 fails as a remake before we've even got to the second area, to be honest. This section is supposed to be the city that defined RE3, but it only seems to represent it on a base level. It doesn't follow the same timeline of events, it doesn't inherit any of its structure, with limited backtracking and exploration featured within the entire area, and it doesn't even want to respect the areas and segments featured in the original. This habit is present throughout the majority of the entire game. Every segment, with one exception, is littered with the same trite and boring tactics used in this part of the game to justify itself as a remake. This section isn't going to be particularly long, and that's for 2 reasons. For one, the sewers aren't very long to begin with, and then by virtue of it being so short, 2, it doesn't have many points against it. That doesn't mean that it's a good area though. The fact that the sewers have multiple criticisms against it, despite how short it is, means that it doesn't really do anything right. The sewer is essentially 3 curved hallways. There is no strategy required to navigate any of it. Without any enemies in the area, the entire thing can be run from start to finish in 30 seconds. The puzzle is a basic key that allows you to only have one door open at a time, but the real challenge is just not forgetting it at the first door you open. If we're being generous, the entire thing is about a 14-minute venture. It's not enjoyable in any way, and it's not interesting in a structure or enemy variety. I think its inclusion is actually completely wasted, especially considering that this wasn't even in the original game. Someone removed places from the original game to add another pointless fucking sewer section. Why? Resident Evil 3 has a very specific tendency to do this on more than one occasion, and I think that every time it happens, where something gets replaced or supplemented with something else, it comes off as lazy and boring. When we begin to consider that dev time was taken from adding more depth to the city, it's hard to imagine what the point of something like this was in the first place. The RPD, just by virtue of it being well designed, would make it a fine segment, and originally on my first playthrough, I thought it was quite cool going back to the police station. However, after a second evaluation of this segment, I think it's quite a potent example of the dev team being lazy, because this could have been removed from the game entirely, and you wouldn't see a real difference in quality overall. Like the sewers, there is barely any strategy in its environment. There is no utility to knowing the layout prior, because all of the doors, by the very hyper-specific scenic route they want you to take through the RPD to get to the STARS command room, are blocked off, and completely inaccessible from where you are. It is essentially a neutered, cookie-cutter hallway simulator with no thought as to its purpose, as it doesn't change the RPD in a significant enough way to justify keeping it in the game, and it also isn't an engaging challenge, as its idea of difficulty is to throw a bunch of shit at you and hope it sticks. With all this in mind, the game has not earned the right to reuse content after it's barely provided me with anything tangible to chew on in the first hour, let alone the last 5 minutes. To be clear, I don't have a problem with devs reusing assets in a game. In fact, if you can reuse an asset in a game, as a developer, I think you have an obligation to do so. Reusing assets previously created for a different segment of the game is just good game design. It's quite an effective strategy for a small piece of the environment or objects from a previous level to be reused for a new segment. Furthermore, I don't even have a problem with reusing the RPD in a vacuum. The problem is that this game is already so far removed from what the original looked like that changing the RPD like this just becomes another slog instead of an enjoyable switch up. Replaying this segment was a slap in the face, and comparing it to what it used to be is honestly quite sickening. The original RE3 did reuse the police station in a way that would have you navigate a dumbed down version of it for more or less a plot beat. The difference is that the PS1 version of the RPD and the remakes are completely recontextualized and serve entirely different purposes respective to each game structure. The RPD on PS1 was actually a place you could walk to in the city as Jill. This was because the entire segment had a purpose all its own. It was designed to be the introduction to the Nemesis. It's supposed to demonstrate all the different ways that you can interact with this character. You can choose to fight him in the front entrance, he can ambush you through windows, he will chase you through rooms to come and kill you, and if you end up killing him, he will provide you with stronger weapons to use throughout the late game. This was technically Nemesis's tutorial. I thought it did well at trying to teach me what this character was capable of and how I could benefit from encounters with him. But just to come back to the RPD point, the facts are that this really intelligently implemented reuse of assets was essentially removed for a dumbed down shoot 'em up section that doesn't teach you anything nor adds value to the experience overall, other than playtime of course. I think that's pretty disgraceful, and it completely pisses in the face of what the original game did with its reuse of assets. Now I can jump back to Nemesis.
Hey! Fuckface!
I've put off talking about the Nemesis because I think that first and foremost, the most important part about any game would be its basic structure and gameplay rather than the unique features that are there to add more challenge or replayability, as well as the fact that Nemesis wasn't the entire point of RE3. I've gone back and forth on whether or not the devs felt the same way, because there are glimpses of understanding in Nemesis's design, but the experience overall boils down to constantly being annoyed at his presence because of how badly the game misunderstands them. Which in a sense is somewhat ironic, because despite how different both versions of the Nemesis feel, they are both almost entirely scripted. Nemesis will appear at multiple points throughout the story, all at the exact same time, in the exact same location on every single playthrough. And yet I would describe one as suffocating and the other as terrifying. Nemesis' appearance in the remake are always met with a cutscene, he's always doing something new, or appearing at some critical point in the game's story, and because of that he's actually quite boring. I think I'd be willing to bet that the screen time for Nemesis in the original is probably significantly longer than Nemesis in the remake, yet his presence is far more suffocating in the remake because of how he disrupts gameplay. When he comes out for a punch-on, he interrupts with a cutscene, almost every single time. Sometimes you get 2 cutscenes and 2 chase sequences not even 5 minutes removed from each other. The time that he takes up for those encounters is also wasted on boring and uninspired fights, and I think it creates a far more strained relationship with him that does a good job at defanging the Nemesis instead of hyping him up. When Nemesis from PS1 comes out to have a go, he doesn't telegraph his presence, he just comes out. Simple, quick, and effective. Literally in gameplay, and I don't even have to engage with him if I don't want to. I can just fucking leave. That's what made him so unrelenting. The fact that it felt like he could threaten his presence on any screen. Every corner of the city was unsafe because it truly felt like at any time I could be put into a position I may not have the ability to escape from. That's terror. In the remake, I'm constantly bored and never really given a reason to care. Instead of having a conversation with this character in the way of interactions in gameplay, I get cutscenes about how cool or scary or menacing this character is. Resident Evil 2 I thought was supposed to be a blueprint for the Nemesis, but it seems like it takes little to no inspiration from the game at all. After you hit a certain point in Resident Evil 2, the devs believed that you were comfortable enough with the layout of the RPD to present you with another challenge. Mr. X is a roaming juggernaut, who can be stunned but not removed entirely. He stalks you throughout the police station, and his goal is to completely challenge your entire strategic planning process. Hallways that you haven't cleared of enemies before, at this point, become incredibly dangerous. During puzzles, he can enter the room you're in and chase you, and occasionally he will ambush you at the worst possible places. Lickers are super easy to avoid, if you know how to circumvent them, because they're blind. If you always walk in a hallway, you would hypothetically never have to actually engage with one of them. Mr. X changes that. He will force you to run in that hallway. He's quicker than your walking speed, but a bit slower than your running speed. So hallways like this become incredibly dangerous, if not planned for accordingly. I think this is what the Nemesis should have been about. That's essentially what the Nemesis was implied to be, given the smoke and mirrors. A roaming enemy that would stalk you throughout the whole game. What I believe is happening, for this radical contrast in feel from original to remake to be the case, is the devs not reading between the lines to fully understand what the Nemesis was about. Yeah, when you think about it, they function the exact same. But the intricacies in how it's executed make it feel like they don't. Yeah, they look similar, but when comparing how they're presented and what they do, you get the feeling that they aren't treated similarly. Yes, that is the Nemesis, but at the same time, it kind of isn't. I don't even think the scripted pieces he has now are even that great to begin with. The first one is a boring, scripted chase sequence, totally not needed, and it ignores the incredible introduction the original had. The next couple times, it gives you a taste of how it really should have been. He bursts through the wall here, and you have to circumvent him by stunning him, fighting him, or just running. This gets incredibly close to how it originally was, but after the second time in the plaza, it never really happens again. The next time you find him, he has a flamethrower. This is his first boss encounter. The point of this fight is to shoot it enough so that it explodes, then you finish him off. It's an okay fight. Then we get another chase scene, not even 5 minutes separated from each other. This is the second most aggravating aspect to the Nemesis. His appearances are suffocating. There truly was no need to have this chase scene, especially after only a 5-minute break from him. The next fight is at least decently spaced out, and somewhat entertaining. The next 2 encounters being the last fight in S2, and then the actual final fight, which is essentially a glorified puzzle. These 2 segments are 4 fucking minutes removed from each other. It is kind of a shame, because honestly, they were a bee's dick away from a great experience. But I think it is a multifaceted problem. Nemesis, to an extent, is a victim of the game's structure. Even in gameplay, these segments are entirely too short to implement a true roaming enemy correctly, and the structure of the hallways and rooms, even in some of the later segments, is way too small to be forcing you to fight an unstoppable enemy. How is it fair to be expected to fight a Mr. X-like enemy in a space that is only big enough for one person? How are you expected to avoid him when there's only one pathway back through this area? How are you even expected to fight him in this tiny corridor when he's right up your ass? The answer for the dev team was probably never considered. He's scripted on PS1, so that's what he is here. I think it completely misses a slam dunk opportunity for some great gameplay experiences. When watching videos and researching, the biggest fattest fucking quotation marks you'll ever see in your life, about Resident Evil 3, I thought it would be an appropriate idea to see what other people thought about the game. The biggest criticism shared across all these people is that the obsession with making Nemesis the point of the game is what ruined him. I think that's correct, and irrespective of the developers' thoughts about Nemesis's implementation, that criticism still rings true. The only part of this game that gets close to how the original was is downtown, without a doubt. I think that's because of the spread out structure of the world, and more specifically how Nemesis is handled. The rest of the game is nowhere near how the original was structured, and that's why, for one, Nemesis changes after this segment, and two, it's why the game feels worse to play. Because after we leave the city, the way it changes makes the game incapable of accommodating that type of gameplay after the city section is over. That's unfortunately the most representative aspect of the entire experience.
Sure, we break some balls here tonight, but I go way back. And in light of recent humiliations, it's an honor to be joined by men. And not f***ing-ass c***hole-ing suckers like married my cousin. He should fucking die.
The game actually increases in quality once we enter the Spencer Memorial Hospital. This section of the game is quite good. I think it truly encapsulates what this game should have been, as there isn't really much it does wrong. Resident Evil 3 takes this short but effective section and completely overhauls it, with a strong sense of atmosphere and a level of coherent gameplay previously unseen throughout any of its previous segments. The fact that it changes the game in any capacity will kind of always be a negative if we're strictly looking at the way Capcom chooses to remake these games, but I think that the remake improves this section over the original, which is why it doesn't really bother me that much. It does well to exceed the boring gameplay that defines the first 3 acts. The design of the hospital revolves around backtracking and entering new sections to open up shortcuts for you to traverse through. Using the windows from the second floor, you can jump down into sections of the map only accessible from the one side. You get to come back through here as Jill as well, so there is great value to charting out the hospital and making sure the areas are cleared out so that when you do come back through here, you aren't completely caught off guard. This section makes use of all its hallways and uses great little gimmicks to challenge the player into adapting to the situation around them. Then, it adds a new threat. The hunters were also introduced in the hospital, and they fight in a remarkably similar way. They'll avoid your shots and they'll overwhelm you, just like in the original. They're pretty tough as well, considering that you aren't fighting with your usual arsenal. You're playing Carlos, and he only has a pistol and a rifle. They're okay, but they're somewhat weaker than what you find on Jill. This means that fighting them is a commitment, as it will drain resources from you if you decide to kill them. The devs take the hospital and completely remake it in a way that would go so far as to improve upon it rather than remove it for some half-assed attempt at survival horror. This is one of the only times I'll ever say that the remake actually outdoes the original. In Resident Evil 3, the PS1 version, the hospital section for Carlos is quite short and very easy. This is because this assault rifle is really strong, and you're allowed to carry more than what is necessary for this bit. While the original was pretty cool, I don't think it was very impactful in its execution. Most of the time you're walking through hallways that are clearly lit and very basic looking. There are some really great shots from the offices in the labs, but after that it doesn't really do much with itself. Why the remake is capable of creating interesting sections like this, but is incapable of making any other area in the game of a similar quality, I will never understand. The hospital should show you more than anything that these developers are more than competent enough to make a great game. Nest 2 will show you the exact opposite, as it is actually so boring that I didn't actually write a segment on it. It's so vapid and uninteresting that there would actually be nothing more boring than trying to convey that, because I wouldn't be saying anything new or interesting. Unfortunately, it does represent the worst aspect of RE3, and to some extent too, that needs to at the very least be highlighted. The removal of the dead factory for Nest 2 is not only one of the worst decisions made for this game, but is possibly one of the biggest disappointments from a remake I have ever seen in my life. None of what makes the dead factory interesting is kept except for the very basic connection that it's an underground lab. It's aesthetically almost entirely different from the Dead Factory, but at the same time, it shares an identical look and feel to the underground labs from RE2, and most importantly, it doesn't play anything like the original. There isn't really much to say about this segment, other than this practice of removing pieces from the original games is cancerous, and I'm glad it died with RE3, because it was seriously the worst experience having to play through the Dead Factory in the original, which was incredible, by the way, only to have to play it through Nest 2 to compare it. As As a summary of the worst aspects for this bit, the enemy placement is dull and poorly designed, the structure is linear, Nemesis, it's not the dead factory, Nemesis, your mum's also a fat whore. Unlucky, buddy. Before this video is over, I'd first like to highly recommend that you play the Resident Evil Seamless HD mods. Both Resident Evil 2 and 3 are amazing palette cleansers for both of these games. It truly does the game justice in a way that Capcom just hasn't today, even after the release of both of them on GOG. They're a little finicky to install, but as far as I'm concerned, it's completely worth the trouble. The install guide I followed was in the description. Please, please, please! I've learned quite a lot about myself since starting this little project. This all started with Persona 3 Reload. Not just chronologically, but personally. It's interesting to be able to put a timeline to me thinking through any given position. I quite liked that game, and it was the first time I'd ever finished Persona 3, which I loved and was deeply affected by. But as a result, I found it frustrating when I heard people write it off as if their taste was so Puritan, so untainted. What I've realized is that it's usually not actually a matter of taste or being better than someone. It's about what the game stands for and what it means to remake something. I sit in a position now where I am on the other side of the discussion. I am the one who has levied a 40-minute shit list of reasons why RE3R is terrible. And it's more than likely that I will probably be the agitator in this transaction. People still find this game to be enjoyable. I've heard from a couple different places that its meta progression and difficulty settings are great and make combat challenging in a fun way. Some people think that while it's a terrible remake, it's not a bad game. A somewhat similar position to where I was when discussing P3R. What I aim to do now is not condemn this game for how it tackles its source material, or even how it likes to change aspects of the game for better or arguably worse. This video is essentially all the reasons Resident Evil 3, the remake, provides no value for me. This game isn't for me. I uploaded this video 12 months earlier, exactly. Almost listing my critiques in the exact same way, word for word. The difference between then and now is that I've come to an understanding of how we perceive remakes that I had not seen before. I find it quite easy to write off this remake. But you might not feel the same.